You're listening to Garibaldi Red, a Nottingham Forest podcast brought to you by Nottinghamshire Live.
Hello and welcome to Garibaldi Red, our Nottingham Forest podcast. I'm Forest correspondent Sarah Clapson, and I'm delighted to say that today I'm joined by football finance expert Kieran Maguire. Kieran, how are you?
I'm grand, thanks, Sarah. Keeping busy, I think it's fair to say.
Yes, well, it's that time of year, isn't it? All the accounts are coming out. So Forest came out this morning. I've had a very brief look at them, but you're far more up on football finance than I am. I struggle to add 2 + 2 sometimes. So I'm relying on your expert knowledge, but some of the figures that stand out are quite big and quite scary. So just give us an insight into what your thoughts, first of all, on the accounts in general.
Well, the club has lost substantial sums of money. That is fairly common for football clubs in the Championship. So if we take a look over the course of the last decade, Forest have lost around about £200 million over that period. They've got some of that back from selling players, but the other source of cover is the owners digging them out, which we are seeing on a regular basis. So it's tough. The club was impacted by COVID towards the end of the season, which didn't help, but hasn't made a huge dent in the 2020 figures. I think the figures for 2021 will be alarming compared to these.
Yeah. How do they compare, Forest, in terms of other Championship clubs? That big loss looks quite huge. How does that compare with a lot of the others?
It's around about average. If we take a look at the Championship as a whole, in 2019, clubs lost between them over £600 million. So it's a division where there are so many owners who are desperate for their clubs to be promoted, and clearly the fans want that as well. They love the thought of going up to the Premier League. That the clubs invest in talent in the form of players, in transfer fees and wages. Those figures aren't sustainable from a business point of view. So of the 24 clubs in the Championship, normally between 22 and 24 of them are losing money on an annual basis, unless they've got some weird and wonderful sleight of hand in terms of their accounts, which doesn't apply to Nottingham Forest.
Yeah, I know. But when you look at those figures, one that stood out for me was wages compared to the amount of money they're bringing in. Is that sustainable, that kind of figure?
It's not sustainable unless you've got a benefactor at the club, unless you've got an owner who each year is prepared to find 10 to 20 million pounds, and that is quite common. So we've seen that at. Am I allowed to mention Derby County on this show? Well,
we'll let you off.
Their owner's done similar. Sheffield Wednesday. Bristol City, clubs that have been in the Championship for a few years, even the clubs that attract big crowds. I mean, Forest do attract big crowds, but Leeds United, they were losing money hand over fist when they were in the Championship as well. So it's universal. If we take a look at wages for the whole of the Championship over the course of the sort of the last 8 or 9 years. On average, it's been about £105 in wages for every £100 that comes through the door. So if you think about it, the division as a whole has lost money, and that's before you've paid for the electricity for the floodlights. That's before you've put the petrol into the mower for the groundsman. That's before the players have gone on coaches and hotels for matches away from home and things of this nature. So it's a crazy way to run a business, but it has been that way for many years in the Championship.
Yeah, I think I know you. I mean, you mentioned it there. You're reliant on an owner, aren't you, putting money in? Forest, I suppose, are quite lucky in that the owner has come out and said he's very committed. He's trying to show that in terms of the money that he's putting towards different projects. The stadium redevelopment. He said that he's still supporting the academy. If they didn't have that, they'd be in trouble, wouldn't they?
Yes, I mean, they either wouldn't be in the Championship, because they have had to cut their cloth accordingly, or we would be watching a Nottingham Forest, which didn't have the same degree of investment in players that we have seen. So if we take a look over recent years, in 2019, the club spent over 22 million pounds signing players. So and if you sign a player on a big fee, then the player's representatives will say, well, if you've paid 5, 6, 7 million pounds for my client, you've got to pay me accordingly. And the average wages in the Championship are around about £16,000 a week. So they are well paid. They are talented athletes, and it's a short career. So I don't begrudge anybody earning a good wage, but it's not sustainable from a traditional business point of view. But I really, again, I can't stress enough, football is not a traditional business. Normal rules do not apply in football in general, and nowhere more so than the Championship. That relationship between wages and revenue that you mentioned is the highest in Europe year in, year out.
Should Forest fans be worried if they're looking at those accounts? Is it concerning?
I don't think it's too much of a concern, provided the owner is prepared to continue to fund the club. Problems arise when either the owner loses interest. So we saw that at Aston Villa. We saw that at Bolton, where the owner had put in a large sums of money, and both of those owners were in for well in excess of £100 million each, and they just reached a stage where they said enough is enough. And then they sell the club, and if the new owner is either not as wealthy and therefore cannot afford to subsidise the club to the same degree, or is viewing the club as an opportunity to flip, as you might try to do with a house. You buy something, you spend a little bit of money on it, and you try to sell it at a profit. That's when the problems start to arise. So provided you've got stability in terms of the ownership, then I don't foresee major problems. We have seen recently with Forest, I think it was in the last week or two, the owners taking some of the loans and saying, realistically, the club's never going to be in a position to repay us these loans, so we're going to convert them into shares. That happened in these accounts as well. I think the owners are aware of exactly where they are from a financial perspective. And my only concern is that we are operating in a COVID world, which makes things tougher for clubs because you're not selling tickets. Depending upon the nature of the owner's business, that could be hit by COVID as well. So to give you a comparison, we've got Ipswich Town, who have been in the Championship for many years. They've just recently dropped down into League One. Their owner makes all of his money from events and hospitality. And that's fine. Very successful business, very successful individual. What happens to the events and hospitality business during a pandemic is that tanks. So all of a sudden, there's extra pressure put on because he might not necessarily have the money to bail out the club. I don't see that as being the position necessarily with Forest. At the same time, you want the club to be able to stand on its own 2 feet at some point in time.
Yeah, you mentioned there about those shares. Explain for people like me who know nothing about it, whether that's a good thing, whether it's a bad thing, what that means essentially.
It's a weird one. It doesn't affect the value of the club. What is effectively happening is that the owner has got two pieces of paper from the club, one of which is an IOU for £20 million, £40 million, whatever it's going to be, and the other is shares. And all that they're doing is that they're ripping up the IOU and they're giving them more shares. So it's a paper exercise. It's a bit of housekeeping. If I was being, I'm not generally not trying to be mischievous. If I was trying to make the club look better in terms of a potential sale, it might be the type of thing that I would do, because you don't want to take over a football club that has lots of debt. But there's no evidence that the owners are intending to sell. Are there people interested in buying the club? Yes, there are. But then there's people interested in buying, practically every club in England because it's such a popular sport. So you do see an awful lot of people who refer to themselves as brokers saying, how much would Forest cost to buy? And I get asked, and other people get asked about how much we think the club is worth and things of this nature. And it always looks better if there's less debt on the balance sheet. But, as far as I can make out, the owner wants to get...
But just to be clear, there's nothing dodgy or anything to worry about doing it. It's just a way of making things look tidier.
Yes, it is. It's for example, if one of my kids wants a car, they say, "Dad, will you lend me $5,000 to help me buy the car?" I give them $5,000. In theory, they owe me $5,000. In practice, I know I'm never going to get that money. So at some point, I say to them, "Okay, let's just go. Let's forget the pretense." It's written off, and that's what we've done here. So the owner, to a certain extent, is a bit like the bank of mum and dad.
You've never met my dad because he's clearly keeping a tally. He's got a list, so doesn't apply. I remember speaking to you last year, when you explained a bit about FFP, and I remember you saying that this year's accounts would be quite a big one in terms of balancing the books in that respect. How do you think Forest are placed in terms of FFP and the sustainability?
Well, the FFP rules have been relaxed for the current season to take into consideration COVID. Forest have also sold players, so they made a profit of over £11 million on player sales, and that will be used to offset some of the day-to-day losses. So I think we're probably in squeaky bum territory in terms of the club cannot afford to be too expansive. And I'm sure Forest fans and Chris Hughton this summer ideally would like to see the club spend a lot of money. I think they will have to be cautious, but that will go for every club in the Championship. And they will be looking therefore next seasons for bargains, for loan signings, for players who are out of contract elsewhere that they can recruit on Bosmans. So is there a lot of wiggle room at Forest? No, there isn't. But the rules have been diluted to take into consideration the impact of COVID on the game. And I think if Forest apply those additional allowances, then they'll get through. It's noticeable in these accounts that whereas normally Forest have been spent £22 million, as I said, in 2019, they only spent £5.5 million or just over that in 2020 in terms of player recruitment, and probably with a mind to that financial fair play has to be dealt with. So it looks as if they've been operating with a view to ensuring that they are within the limits.
I know you said the rules have been relaxed because of what's been going on. Do you see that changing quite soon? Do you think it will go back to normal FFP rules?
It certainly won't until 21-22. Ultimately, the financial fair play rules are voted for by the owners of clubs. So if we get to this summer and they're all in a meeting together with Rick Parry and they say, "Look, Rick, we need another year of relaxation," they need a 2/3 vote. So if 16 of them put up their hands and say, "We're going to relax the rules for another 12 months," then the FFP are duty bound to apply, because the EFL, and I think this is, people think that the EFL is independent of the clubs. It's not. The EFL is a members club, and therefore ultimately the rules are those which are determined by the members themselves.
Yeah, they have been reliant. I guess they always will be reliant, because they're in the Championship, on selling players, aren't they, Forest? They need to sell players to balance the books, to then move forward. Do you see that potentially having to happen again this summer? Do they need a big player sale?
I think there will be player disposals. Such is the nature of the game. If we take a look at the last 4 seasons, in each year there were player sales of at least, we're talking 8 figures. We're talking a minimum of £11 million. in the last 4 seasons. So I think the club will be considering that. They'll also be fully aware that the transfer market has collapsed. So whilst people will say, well, Chelsea and Manchester City and Manchester United and Liverpool, they can go out and spend money. They all have the benefits of either ridiculously wealthy owners or huge commercial deals, or the Champions League, which brings in hundreds of millions of pounds. Yeah. So we've got to separate out what's happening at the elite level of football compared to sort of the mid-tier where Forest are. There'll be relatively little money spent in the Championship. The only clubs that will spend money will either be those clubs which have just been relegated from the Premier League, and that's probably on the back of selling a couple of their players, or clubs taking a sell to buy approach, i.e. we'll sell a player for 10 million and we might reinvest half of that in recruiting replacements. But the fees demanded are going to fall for both buying and selling. So if Forest did have players who they thought they could sell for 10 to 15 million pounds, they're probably going to have to accept lower prices because the European market for players has collapsed. The broadcasting deals in places like France have been ripped up, and there's huge problems on the continent. And therefore, you're looking, well, where else in England can we sell players to? The bottom half of the Premier League, all the clubs there are losing huge sums of money. So they are being careful as to what they spend. And with no disrespect, how many players do Forest have that Chelsea or Manchester United or Liverpool are going to be willing to sign for in the 40 to 50 million pound bracket, which is sort of the size of the pool that those clubs tend to operate in?
Yeah. Is it a system that's designed? Are they kind of reliant on getting to the Premier League eventually? Is it kind of that's what it's obviously what the goal is on the pitch, but is that what the financial system is based on?
Yes, it's casino football management in the sense that over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen Forest's wage bill has, if I've got the figures here, in 2013 it was 19 million pounds. Now in 2020 it's 38. I don't know about you, Sarah, but my wages haven't doubled in the last 7 years. I can assure you. I speak to my friends, and nobody's telling me about double-digit pay rises every year. So it is a case of clubs spending more money on player wages in the hope, and this is why I call it casino. They are gambling on those players coming up trumps and helping to take the club to the Premier League. The trouble is, it's not just Forest that are doing that. It is Derby. It is the other clubs in that division that have been there for many years who have been trying exactly the same thing. And at some point in time, they're going to realise that it doesn't matter how much money you spend on wages. Only 3 clubs can still be promoted.
Yeah, that's the harsh reality, isn't it? It doesn't matter how much money you put in. They found out last year. It doesn't guarantee success. You're in the lap of the gods sometimes. But if you're looking at this set of accounts, obviously next year we'll have the full effect of the coronavirus pandemic. So in anticipation of that, is next year going to be a really tough year?
Yes, because Nottingham Forest, they make around about £7 million a year from ticket sales. Well, this season's been wiped out. In terms of their commercial sponsors, there will be fewer of them around this season because many companies themselves are saying, well, we'd hire boxes, we'd have events taking place at the stadium, in terms of catering or conferencing and things of this nature. That's not going to take place. The TV deals, I think there's going to be some slight rebates given. The one positive is that the iFollow system will have generated some money for the club, but it will be relatively small compared to the revenue streams which have been lost as a result of the pandemic. So 2021, there's going to be a lot of red in terms of losses throughout the whole of football.
I'm guessing you've kept up with the Football Index headlines as well that have been going on. Obviously, therefore, as shirt sponsors, we're told that deal ends in the summer. So you imagine that there'll be a change of shirt sponsorship, you would think, or they'll at least think about it. Is it going to be difficult? Is it going to be harder to try and get a new shirt sponsor in this kind of market?
Yes, I mean, if we take a look at summer 2020, it was noticeable that a lot of shirt sponsorship deals were only agreed in the 3 to 4 weeks before the season started, because there was sort of a game of cat and mouse between clubs and potential sponsors to see who was going to blink first. I've spoken to some commercial directors of clubs in the Championship, and the thing that's coming back is twofold. First of all, there's not as many sponsors around, and secondly, there's a genuine fear within the division of the potential forthcoming ban on sponsorship from the gambling industry. So if you're looking at a shirt sponsorship deal, realistically, the gambling companies pay, they're not the only kids in town, but they're the biggest in terms of the willingness to spend. So it's going to be tough finding a new sponsor. I know what some clubs are trying to do is to sort of get ahead of the rest of the crowd by signing up with non-gambling sponsors on 2 or 3 year deals, which aren't necessarily huge, but might look quite good in 6 months' time, depending on where government edicts dictate.
Yeah, it all sounds quite bleak and quite grim. But if you're a Forest fan, then what can you give them any kind of encouragement in terms of the figures and the Championship in general? Is there obviously they're hoping that on the pitch it's going to come to fruition, but is there any kind of glimmer of hope in there?
Yes, I mean I'm slightly biased. I'm a Brighton fan, and Chris Hughton used to be our manager. I think what Forest have is a manager who is used to getting the maximum out of players in the Championship and knows what has to be done in terms of putting together a promotion challenge. And you don't necessarily have to spend huge amounts of money to do that. At the same time, you can't do it on a shoestring as a rule. But Sheffield United were promoted on the back of having a strong dressing room. Huddersfield Town were, Brighton were under Chris as well. So it's not necessarily a case of the 3 clubs that are going to be relegated from the Premier League will have such a financial advantage that they'll automatically drop back. They'll bounce back. So if the club recruits smartly over the course of the summer, there will also be players out of contract, so that they'll either be offered lower deals or they'll be allowed to move on. I think there will be monies saved and monies released, which can then be invested. Looking at it from a financial fair play perspective, as we've already said, there's limited wiggle room, even if the owners wanted to put in unlimited funds as to what they could do from a financial fair perspective. So it all comes down to doing things better rather than just spending money to get out of this division.
Yeah, obviously as a Brighton fan, you'll know how Chris Hughton operates. He is quite a smart, clever operator, isn't he? He can work well in the transfer market, and he can get the best out of players. We've seen that at Forest with former Brighton players, Glenn Murray, Anthony Knockaert, Gaten Bong. He's got them going well. So there is hope there, hopefully. Yes.
I mean, as anybody that's ever met Chris Hughton, he's also the nicest man in football.
He is.
And I can assure you, from our perspective as Brighton fans, we'd be absolutely delighted if Forest went up, because we all love Chris, and we're quite fond of Glenn Murray and Anthony Knockaert and Gaten Bong as well, because in the year we were promoted, Anthony Knockaert was voted the best player in the Championship, and Glenn Murray scored 20 plus goals. So if it's any consolation, we're wanting you to do well, because there is that affection for those former players. They are still held in enormously high regard.
Thank you ever so much, Kieran. I really appreciate it. Just for a bit of background, give people a bit of information about yourself and what's your normal job, rather than just spending time talking about Forest accounts or Championship accounts. Or
well, this is. I did 3 hours of podcasting yesterday on various football account stuff, but I'm just a teacher. I teach at the University of Liverpool. I've managed to convince them that football finance is a genuine subject. So I teach that on the football MBA course that we run there, and I also teach it to undergraduates. And as you can imagine, in a city such as Liverpool, it's a course which gets a lot of attention because. So many young people are interested in the sport. It's and also from my point of view, it's a way of teaching traditional finance through a sort of a Trojan horse. In that, if I say, well, today we're going to take a look at the accounts of Forest and let's take a look at some of the absolutely crazy numbers involved, then they all prick their ears up because there's a story to be told. There's something to be learned. There's something to go and tell their family when they get home. Especially, as I'm working in Liverpool and Everton, they don't like each other too much. Nothing compared to how much Liverpool fans hate Manchester United. So all the dirt that you can find through going through these numbers is lapped up.
And if people want to find out more about yourself or about football finance, is there a website? Is there I know you've got a nice book. Is there anything that they can do to?
Well, I do a twice weekly podcast called The Price of Football with comedian Kevin Day, and we look at all the stories which are coming out. We were persuaded to set up this podcast by one of the journalists at the BBC, who's sort of the producer of the show, and we both looked at each other and said, well, A, nobody's going to listen, and B, we'll run out of stories in 3 weeks, and that was 18 months ago. We've gone from 20 minutes a week, which was our first podcast together. We're now putting out over 2 hours of material a week, and we're getting 30 to 40,000 downloads every week. So it does appear to have struck a chord with fans and also people operating in the game. I run The Price of Football effectively on Twitter, and I wrote a book of the same name. But I wrote the book for my students because there wasn't a football finance book. It was a labour of love, but it was also a miserable experience because every time I thought I'd finished it, there was new stuff coming out.
I can imagine it's non-stop, especially when you're trying to talk to people like me who have absolutely no understanding about it. So you do a good job of explaining it in layman's terms, which is what we all need. I think it's if you know about the topic, it's great. If you don't, you're sat there scratching your head thinking, I don't get it at all. But so that's why we need people like you.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for the invite on the show.
No, thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it, and thank you all for listening and watching.
Thank you for listening to Garibaldi Red, a Nottingham Forest podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, then please let us know. We love hearing your feedback. We'll be back soon with another episode. Thanks for listening.